Hi everyone. Today I'll be talking about an operating model for API platform teams. And I'll be focusing on operating platform lessons we can learn from the NHS England API platform team. So rather than talk about just a generic operating model, I'll just focus on a few operating platform lessons we can learn from the NHS England API platform team. So first, a little bit about me. My name is Ikenna Nwaiwu. I'm an independent API consultant. I'm the author of Automating API Delivery, API Ops with OpenAPI, published by Manning early in 2024. I'm also working on a report titled Tackling API Sprawl, a review of internal developer portal tool support for API governance. So where I talk about how different internal developer portals support API governance in the API delivery workflow. As an independent API consultant, I help my clients solve API governance problems in three main areas. The first is API sprawl, where there's a proliferation of APIs in the organization and little or no standardization. The second is API drift, where there's a divergence between API documentation and implementation. And the third is high API delivery lead time, where API design and delivery take too long. I also provide advisory services to both API providers and API tool vendors on solving these problems. For the agenda of this talk, I'll start by talking about the problem, what I call the problem of API delivery, and I'll talk about the two customer mindset and what that means. I'll also talk about a second key to solving this problem of API delivery called which I call increasing abstraction, and then I'll conclude. Okay, so let's talk about this problem of API delivery at scale. What do I mean by that? The API delivery problem, as I would define it, is about how to structure people, processes, and technology to deliver consistent, secure, and high-quality APIs at scale. And this API delivery and the API delivery capabilities we can talk about in this would involve things like designing APIs, developing APIs, testing APIs, deploying APIs, securing APIs, and documenting APIs. Now, the way to deliver APIs at scale is to create an API platform. Okay, so that's the answer, create an API platform. But what do we mean by an API platform? I'd describe it as a collection of tools, capabilities, and documentation that support developing, deploying, and operating APIs. It includes things like API gateways, API developer portals, style guides, process documentation, golden path templates, deployment pipelines, API linting tools, API breaking chain check tools, API documentation linting tools, observability tools, monitoring, alerting, and so on. And an API platform team is a team responsible for building and managing your API platform. A platform team focuses on understanding customer needs and developing the tools, capabilities, and documentation for that platform. But the question is, how do you ensure great results from your API platform team? I'm going to suggest two metrics for this. The first is API customer satisfaction as a proxy for quality. And the second is your API delivery lead time. To improve these metrics, I'll argue that teams need to do two things. First, they need to have what I call a two customer mindset, as opposed to a one customer mindset. And secondly, they need to introduce relevant abstractions to lower the lead time and simplify API development. So I'm going to be looking at these keys and explaining more about them next. So let's look at the first one, the two customer mindset. One problem I see in some API platform teams is that they think that their API customers or their API consumers are their only customers. This is a myth. This one customer mindset leads to poor API producer empathy and a poor API producer experience. And having this poor API producer experience ultimately leads to a poor API consumer experience. Now, a countermeasure to this is to treat both API consumers and API producers as customers, using techniques like jobs to be done, which is a framework for identifying what a user is trying to accomplish, surveys, both quantitative, where you gather quantitative and qualitative information on how customers are using the platform, and do a benefit analysis, clearly articulating benefits to both the API consumers and producers. Now let's look at a great example of where these techniques have been applied. In my opinion, the NHS England API platform is a great example of a team that adopts this two-customer mindset. NHS England oversees the planning and delivery of the National Health Service in England. So let's start by looking at the problem the NHS England API platform team faced when they started their API program. The core problem the platform team faced was that interoperability in the healthcare industry is very difficult. There were all sorts of challenges to integration from a technology, clinical, product, privacy, and safety perspective. Therefore, the NHS England API platform team articulated a goal to make integration easier for everyone, both for external API consumers and internal API producers, by developing a one-stop API platform. One key success metric the platform team used to measure its progress towards this goal was an API satisfaction survey it ran annually. I will talk about this a bit more later. Now let's look at how the team addressed the first part of the two-customer mindset, which is defining API consumer benefits. The API platform team took the time to clearly articulate the benefit of the API platform team to their API consumers. The benefits they defined included the following. First, a consistent experience using standards like FHIR and OAuth 2, self-service access to sandbox environments, clear documentation, and a single support point of contact. By the way, FHIR is a fast healthcare interoperability resources standard, which is a global standard for healthcare data exchange. Now let's look at their approach to the second part of the two-customer mindset, which is defining API producer benefits. The API platform team considered lots of user interviews the API platform team conducted lots of user interviews with the development teams who would use the API platform to publish APIs. Based on those interviews, they defined the following benefits for their API producer customers. First, a quicker, more predictable API delivery process. Second, one-click API platform setup tool. Easy setup of an API of a CI/CD pipeline for API deployment, providing multiple path to live environments. A great API delivery process documentation for self-service guidance, one of the most comprehensive I've seen, and dedicated support for API producers. But to arrive at these benefits, let's look at the user need analysis the team did based on their user interviews. The platform team ran a user needs analysis in which they identified several users or customer groups. Now, I'll just discuss two of these here, external developers and internal developers. But there were other user groups they identified, such as testers, API testers, product owners and managers, and so on. Some of the needs of the external developers, or i.e. API consumers, were to learn how to integrate with the NHS APIs, to understand the authentication mechanism, to learn how to integrate and test their APIs, and to get help and support. Some of the needs of the internal developers were to understand API delivery lifecycle, to have a platform to build on, and to get help and support. Now, let's drill into what the platform did to address this have a platform to build on need from the internal developers. Here are some of the tools in the API platform stack, which the team built for their internal developers. First of all, they had an API gateway. They used Apigee Edge for that. And they had AWS as their cloud vendor. But they also use Local Stack, which is a cloud service emulator that runs in a single container on a developer's laptop or in a CI environment. With Local Stack, they could run AWS applications or Lambdas entirely in the local machine without connecting to kind of a remote cloud provider, AWS. They also use Keycloak as the identity provider. They had several monitoring and observability tools, Splunk, Grafana, Prometheus, so on. And they used feature upvote as their interactive product backlog, where they could get customer input on their product backlog for their API platform, features for their API platform. So what was the result of all this user focus, all this customer focus, both on the consumer side and on the producer side in terms of building out the platform? Let's look at their success measure, their API satisfaction survey. The team ran an API satisfaction survey each year to gauge the success of their platform. Their approach was to ask for a rating from their users on a 1 to 5 point scale on several different areas, such as learning, design and build, onboarding, help and support, plus an overall rating. Here are the results plotted over time, and you can see how the results have increased from 2020 to 2023. I'll just show this little video that shows the different axes on which they took their surveys, like learning, testing, design and build, onboarding, the kind of qualitative comments. You can see some of the comments they got from the users, and where they plot all these satisfaction metrics together on one simple chart. So that's available on their website, and you can see references to this on the slides at the end of the presentation. Okay, so that's what the NHS England did NHS England API platform team did to gather customer feedback, both from API consumers and API producers. But when I was at Apidays Paris presenting this, making this presentation, I also took a poll internally of the audience to ask some questions to understand what the state of their API delivery was and API satisfaction was, especially from the producer side of their API delivery teams. And I would like to show you here some of the results and what that showed. So I asked a question, I gave the following statement and asked the audience to agree or disagree with it. And the statement was, in my organization, our teams, including non-devs, can easily find any of our API descriptions, for example, Open API or Async API or GraphQL API descriptions, and that there's a central place to search, read, and retrieve API descriptions. Now, one thing to note about this is everybody in the room agreed that their organization builds, designs and builds API. So these were all API providers. And what we found was that 43% of the audience in the room didn't agree with the statement. They disagreed. Okay, and if we add that to those who so 43%, disagreed with, which is quite a high number, that they did not have a single place in the organization to find and retrieve API descriptions. So API discovery was probably a challenge for that set. And then we had 14% who were not sure of if they could find all their API descriptions in one place. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And then the next question I asked the audience was, or the next statement was, there are no bottlenecks in our API design and review process. The process is quite smooth and developers are happy with it. Again, I presented a Likert scale for them to agree or disagree with this statement. And 56%, over half of the audience, disagreed with this statement. They thought there was a lot of bottlenecks in their API design and review process. And we're just talking about API design and review. The process wasn't smooth, so 56% disagreed with the statement. In fact, 6% strongly disagreed with the statement. So that is over, over 60% of the participants in this during my presentation at Apidays wouldn't agree that they had a smooth API design and review process. So So that's very indicative of what I was talking about here about measuring API producer satisfaction with the API delivery process. So I've talked about that, this kind of two customer mindset, and let me just summarize that with a few lessons that we can take, learning from the NHS England API team. So the first is that we should treat both API consumers and producers as customers of the platform, and running things like API satisfaction surveys is a good way to capture satisfaction and have that user-centric view of both consumers and producers for platform teams. The second point is to make sure we do qualitative and quantitative user research to understand the customer needs, okay, both from the producers and the consumers. And thirdly is that we should clearly articulate the benefits of the API platform to both customer groups. Okay, so I'm going to move over to the next, the second major key I talked about to help improve API platform teams is about increasing abstractions. So what do I mean by this? Another problem I've seen API teams face is that they have manual or complex API delivery processes. This leads to, these manual or complex API delivery processes leads to error-prone API delivery and high lead times. Now, one countermeasure to this is to introduce technology that increases the level of abstraction to help dev teams deliver APIs quicker. Okay, so let's look at an example of this. And we'll pick the NHS England API platform team and look at how they deploy APIs. The NHS England API platform team was faced with the problem of a manual API proxy creation and API deployment process that led to very high lead times. It had mostly manual steps and required an in-depth knowledge of Apigee and Azure DevOps and AWS and several other tools. Development teams had to follow a long, detailed checklist of manual steps. This process initially was taking between 3 to 8 weeks to publish a new API to the platform. To counter this issue, the API platform team built an abstraction called Proxygen. It's a service that API developers could use to deploy APIs to the platform without having a detailed knowledge of Apigee, Azure DevOps, or AWS, or any of the underlying API platform technology required to deploy their APIs. Effectively, they were building an abstraction over all these technologies, underlying technologies, to make it easier for their customers, their API producers, to deploy APIs to their platform. Okay, so they were really abstracting away that underlying technology. This abstraction led to a 75% decrease in the lead time and a 50% reduction in the API support burden that the API platform team faced. Let's look a bit more about this abstraction they built called Proxygen. Proxygen is an internal use NHS England service for API producers, for API producer teams deploying and running services on their API management platform. It generates API proxies using an open API description file. It has an API itself and also a CLI for publishing API instances to a given environment. It implements things like rate limiting or sending traffic to the backend or hosted container. That's all done by you specify the rate limits in your open API file, and lots of other configuration is done in the open API file, and Proxygen takes that, deploys it to the platform, and sets up the configuration. It also serves as a central registry for all APIs on the platform. Okay, and that's on my slide. You can see a URL if you'd like to know more about the Proxygen service. It's an internal use service, so not one that most other teams could use, but it's just interesting to see the capabilities that tool provided. For those interested, here is just a simple, just an open API spec from the Proxygen service showing the operations that it makes available to users, and you can also see a command line usage of for that tool for deploying open API, for deploying APIs to the platform. Okay, so a few lessons from this about introducing abstractions. The first is that using that abstraction greatly improved their lead time and greatly reduced their quality, their API support burden. But that abstraction also changed. They essentially changed the abstraction from developers having to think about having to need specialist knowledge about Apigee or any of their other underlying technologies, Azure DevOps and things like that, to just knowing about this simple Proxygen tool. And so in other ways, they were more agnostic to the underlying API gateways. The second thing is that it also encouraged standardization of the deployments in a self-service manner, and it provided great, as well as the abstraction itself, they also had some great documentation to support that. So I'm going to summarize now on those two key lessons that we can learn from the NHS England API platform teams, which is that first, to deliver APIs at scale, we need an API platform team. And that those two keys for high performance API platform teams that organizations can think about is that, first of all, they need API platform teams to have a true customer mindset. They should not think about not just API consumers, but also about API producers. And that manual or complex processes, we can introduce an abstraction to lower the lead time and improve the quality of our APIs. Thank you very much for listening to me. Here are some references if you'd like to find out more about this, about the journey the NHS England platform team went to build their API platform. And you can also reach out to me on LinkedIn and follow me on LinkedIn. I publish a newsletter called the Ikenna Consulting Newsletter, and you're very welcome to subscribe to that. Thank you very much for listening.